Welcome to Friday night's video and our mastering series. In this series, we are going to address all aspects of a good production, so that whether or not you're a producer that's producing the whole production, or whether or not you are somebody who is producing it yourself and want to be able to do all aspects of production, or whether or not you are going to one area as like a recording engineer or mastering engineer, that you are going to be able to have a pretty good idea of the things that are going to be really important for you to focus on in your production and at all these different phases of the production. Just keep in mind that every production can be different, and you are more than likely going to do things different than other people. And you really need to take into consideration when you have to be comparable to other people in the same genre, so that your music streaming is heard as comparable and sounds pretty much like they're doing it at this point, so that you get noticed as being somebody doing a good job with way that reggae is being recorded, mixing, and mastered today, so that you don't be seen as, someone who isn't doing a good job in your production. And that has to be something you very much need to take into consideration. And things can be very much done different in different productions, whether you're working with a movie score, whether you're working with a symphony, a heavy metal, an R&B record, and things like that. Sometimes different songs in the same genre have to be different things done to them and done differently. Sometimes different sections of different songs have to be done differently, and your processes, you need to go through them a little bit differently. But hopefully by the time we get into this series, you've got a really good checklist to go through, so that whether or not you got a lot of money or a little money, that even if you're just a little home studio, that you can do a good project from beginning to end. So basically, that's in this first video. Let's just really quick kind of go through what we're really needing to focus on. The first thing you need to really work on is your organization and your cleanliness. Having things as organized as possible and as clean as possible, so you don't have a mess to work with. So that when you go into the studio, as you're putting things together and as you're putting your songs together, and whatever you're doing before you ever get to the part of recording, that keep your stuff clean and organized and well put together, and so that it's not frustrating for you people you're working for, so that you can find stuff easily, so that you can work through the production as smoothly as possible and have things as organized and clean as possible and as well put together as possible before you ever even start recording. That's a huge thing, so that you can really have a smooth production happening. And what you're going to do, try to get things, laid out from beginning to end as best you can, what all you're going to get done before you start, so that you can flow through it as smooth as possible, and that's a huge thing to keep in mind. So that is a huge concept. And your attitude, keep a positive attitude. Try to spread positive vibes everywhere you can. If there's negativity happening, try to inject it with positivity as best you can throughout a production at all phases. Next, let's talk about what we're going to do. We're going to talk about recording. First of all, your first thing is when you're recording. Now, when you're recording, some of the most important aspects you're going to run into is, we've talked about being prepared as possible. The biggest thing is just a good performance, accuracy, clarity, and that your timing is as well in time and as good a performance as possible. This is huge. Does that make sense? And making sure everything's set up properly, all your settings are set up properly, and you get a good capture that doesn't have any distortion, no clipping, no weak quiet parts, as little background noise as possible, that you've got a good full loud capture that's not clipping and distorting with weak parts, so you just get a good capture. These are huge things, so that when you go into the recording procedure, that you've dealing with, that you've got a good performance, that it's done well in time, and you've got a really good capture, that there's no clipping and distortion, background noise, all kinds of crap like that, and that that the instrument is set up as well as possible, the There is no clipping. It's not recorded too quiet so that you miss part of the harmonic content of the instrument, so that you can't EQ it well later, so that it sounds as good as possible. And making sure this first phase of your recording is just done as well as possible, that it's as good a performance as possible, as good in time as well as possible, and that the capture is done as well as possible so that you can do magic later in the studio. Next, we'll go to editing. Editing is hugely important because basically what you're going to do in editing is first of all, you want to clean it up. And if you go back and watch this other video about flow editing, things like that, going in there and doing a good job at editing to make sure it's clean, it sounds good, you've cleaned it up, whether you got to use RX6 or high pass, low pass filter things, just do as much cleaning as possible to make sure that, whatever you recorded, any issues that you're having, that you take care of. This is before mic processing. So you're going through and kind of looking at some of these things that you're basically wanting to just kind of go through these things and make sure you've got repairs done. Clicks and pops, or, anything that's going on, if it's a little bit out of time, checking your flow editing and all these kind of things, to try to get it cleaned up as well as possible, I know that editing can be kind of hard, so we'll kind of go through it, but editing is very important because after you get done with a really good capture in your recording process, that when you go into editing, that if you can clean it up really good, so it's just pristine and clean and clear, when you get into processing and mixing, that it becomes more fun because you really got good stuff to work with, and it's really important. Then we'll go into first phase processing. First phase processing, normally that I'm going to go through these things here. I'm going to start going through these things and seeing what's going on, and checking things out. I'm going to go through all these things through here, and then I'm going to start dealing with things like sound sculpting of the signal, adding effects, equalization, compression, expansion. We're going to go dealing with the ADSR, body building of it, maximizing the tracks, checking any noise reduction afterwards, then possibly doubling the tracks and doing any work to do there with spatialization and stereo field. That's combined with panning the tracks around. Then go back and make sure there's fades on there so you don't clicks and pops at the end. And just kind of, and then may possibly limit each track if you didn't, get dealt with the maximizer, which it should have. But this is a checklist to go through, to make sure that that's all done really well in the first phase processing of the track. So there's a really good job at all those things done really well. Then subgroup mixing, which means any groups, like a group of violins or a group of guitars, that you mix them really well together, and then you send them to a bus, and then after that you've mixed them really well, and you're really happy with them, that your bus is, you do your subgroup processing, which you're going to basically do any processing on that bus that you've sent that subgroup to make it sound as good as possible. Then you're going to move on to like group mixing, which basically group mixing, as you go through group mixing, you're going to go through and deal with a whole lot of issues of trying to get it mixed so it is done as well as possible. Each section, sometimes, most of the time, I'll mix one section at a time because it changes from one section to the next section of how it should be mixed. And, it's a very complicated process that sounds simple. The better you do the processes before, the simpler this process gets, usually, because it's less of a headache. So done well is very important. Then we're going to group processing. Group processing, I'll normally go through here and I deal with these things again. It's basically going in and I'm doing the checking, any kind of thing like, making sure everything's done well, and have phase issues, sound sculpting, checking the mix, making sure I have to go back a few steps to deal with individual tracks or subgroups or things like that. And then I'll start, checking out whether I need to do like analog annual emulation, console shapers and things like that. Equalization bus, stereo field bus, deal with the mid and side, deal with reverberation bus, spatialization on it, saturation, compression, limiting, dynamics works, limiting the thing, and then possibly putting another maximizer on it to maximize the track once I'm really happy with it. Because that is really important. So then when it gets done, by the time you get to mastering, mastering is a huge process, because mastering can be a lot of times going through it, making sure everything's done, formatting it, and then going through these things again like it's an individual track to try to make this formatted track sound as good as your wave file on your master mix, that you did on the master mix, and as close as possible, which means you might render it down to, format, drag it into the song page, that has the mix on it, and start comparing it. What's missing? Do I need to add more dither? Do I need to add some noise files? Do I need to do some EQ work? What do I need to do? Do I need to do some compression, some limiting, but go ahead and put a maximizer on it? I mean, what all do I need to do in mastering to make it sound, the formatted file sound as good as what that mixed song sounds like in my mix page before I go to the mastering page, or my mastering, whatever you use for mastering. So that's very important, because in this area, this first phase processing is very huge, because you're very much dealing with some of the basics. Sound sculpting is some of the most basic things, the most important things. Equalization, and then you're dealing with things like compression, expansion, bodybuilding, which is going to be dealing with a lot of reverberations and delays and things like that, trying to make your individual tracks sound as good as possible, so that by the time you get to mastering and mixing, or by the time you get to mixing and mastering, that your processing is very minimal. By then you should have done most of the work you need to do back in this phase, so that when you get to those phases, that you're just having to do very light work just to try to work at it, just to try to, just get those final little touches done to it that that are just added. Once it's all mixed together, it might need a little bit of tweaking. Does that make sense? And then when you're mastering, it's basically, mastering is the art of taking things and getting them ready for formatting, and then making sure that the formatted product sounds as close as possible to that mixed production as possible, as close as possible. And sometimes you might deal into some other things that might be called for in the mastering process, that they're asking you to do it for the distribution package, for where they might be sending the product, but they would be informing you of that before you started mastering, so you can take that in consideration of things you might have to do. And also, your job as a mastering engineer is being a mastering engineer, which means you should understand all this stuff and see where there's problems and go, there's obviously a problem there, and be able to catch it and be able to go, well, no, I'm not mastering this. I'm sending this back to the guy because he needs to go back to first phase processing on this drum because that sounds like crap. Or he needs to do that to it and then send it back to me. That is, is sometimes you would think, well, the mastering engineer isn't doing his job. That is his job. He's catch stuff to make you go back and fix stuff, so that when he finishes it and masters it and formats it, that it's done as well as possible. So sometimes his job is to go back a step and say, talk to the recording engineer or the editing engineer or the mixing engineer, and go in the producer and go, well, this ain't right, dude. This is just not cool, and this is going to cause a problem in your production, and you can fix it. I can do this to it, but it would be better if Bob, that mixed it, went back to a subgroup mixing and adjusted those a little bit, because the violins are too loud, or the bass is a little bit too loud, or the keyboard's a little bit too loud there, or too soft, or the choir or something, and boost it up a little bit, bring it down, EQ it a little bit different, before you send it to me, then I'll fine tweak it. But that, what I see needs to be happening there, and sometimes he might ask for the actual mix himself to say, well, this is what I see what's happening, and to show them. That's part of being a mastering engineer. So basically, and then creating a distribution package, which basically means going through there and putting a package together that's that's comprehensive, so that when the mastering is all done, that you've got a complete mastered package to distribute, which can be a little bit complicated, and it can be depending on who you're working for, what the producer's asking for, what the record company's asking for, or what the band's asking you for, or what you decided to do. So we're going to go through all these phases one step at a time. Now, I suggest that you just watch them one phase at a time, so you get a pretty good understanding of all the things that are happening. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this first video on this series, and I'll see you in the next video.